Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kara Solomon, and I'm a conservation coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. Our mission is to protect, conserve, and restore wildlife and habitat in North Carolina. So tonight's speaker is very fitting. I'm here tonight with one of our community wildlife chapters, the South Wake Conservationists. And tonight we are joining you via Zoom. I will be your moderator for this evening, so if you have any questions for our speaker at any point during the presentation, you can type them into the chat function or in the Q&A feature, and I will get them read at the very end of the presentation. So again, if you have a question at any point, go ahead and type it in the chat, type it in the Q&A, and we'll read them out at the end of the webinar. So I'm excited to be with you all tonight, and I'm going to hand things off to the president of the South Lake Conservationists, Monty Murray.
All right. Well, thank you, Kara, as always. And thank you for moderating tonight, because Kara will take all the questions and handle all the hard stuff. I'll just kind of kick things off in the beginning. So welcome tonight to our meeting. The featured topic, living with wildlife. I'm really excited to hear more about that because I think most of us here in North Carolina have a lot of experience with wildlife interacting with our urban or suburban households, and often wonder, what should we plant or not plant, or what should we do? So I'm looking forward to that. But before we get started, I do want to just give you a little quick update on chapter activities. Our mission as a South Wake Conservationist, and we're based in the Raleigh area, is to conserve and improve wildlife habitat and diversity. And, we do a lot of different things to support that. One of them is public education and public events, and this is an example of that. So thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy it. We have a number of other things coming up just in the next month or so, month and a half. We do have a field trip that we have planned. Everybody's welcome. You just go to the website and you can sign up and go with us. We're going to Sylvan Heights Bird Park, which is in Scotland Neck in eastern North Carolina. And it's a wonderful place to look at a whole amazing array of different birds from all over the world. Fascinating, beautiful collection of birds. It's really a research institution, but they also have a wonderful park where you can walk through and see all these different birds. So join us if you can. The website is on the bottom of the slide here. We have some work days that we do. We have one coming up. It's on the 20th, on November 20th. At Johnson Environmental Education Park in Fuquay-Varina, which is a park that we have just started partnering with the Wake Audubon, and we both are very like-minded in many things related to conservation, so we decided to join forces. So we're both working together, working on removing invasives, and we have some other projects planned there as well. So join us for that one if you're available. It's a Thursday, so it is a work day in the morning. All this stuff is on the website. You'll see it on the calendar. And if you want to come, just sign up and join us. We do have a memorial tree planting for our dear friend and an important part of our leadership team for many years, John Kinsella, who passed away this year. So we're planting a white oak tree in his honor at Crowder County Park in Apex. And anybody whose lives he touched that would be able or would like to join us, we would be more than happy to have you join us. It's on November 23rd, and it's at 2:00 at Crowder County Park in Apex. We also have our next in-person meeting at Bass Lake Park, and that will be the first Thursday of December 4th. And Rachel Wood will be coming, and she'll be talking about engaging youth in conservation, a very important topic as well. Making sure the next generation is as aware and inspired about nature and willing to protect it as we are here. And then finally, we do have another work day coming up. It'll probably be the end of November or early December. We're not sure the exact date yet, but it'll be published soon. And that's to maintain a park garden that we've established. It was a native plant shade garden and pollinator plants at Bass Lake Park in Holly Springs. So that's coming up. I don't have an exact date yet, but that's another work day. So that is it for the chapter. Again, visit the website, subscribe if you haven't. And now I'd like to talk about our speaker. So we have a wildlife extension biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and she's been there for over 15 years and has worked with endangered songbirds, white-tailed deer, and a variety of other wild animals and critters. A big part of her job today is helping people understand the wildlife around them, from birds and beavers to coyotes and bears, and how to protect or prevent or address any conflicts between the humans and the wildlife that cross paths. She leads training for the state's wildlife control agent program and also the Wildlife Helpline. She chairs the North Carolina Beaver Damage Control Advisory Board, and she's the lead liaison for the feral swine management in North Carolina. So she is one busy person if you just think about all those different things. Outside of work, she enjoys hiking and foraging for mushrooms, which I haven't dared do yet because you got to really know what you're doing when you're foraging mushrooms, especially if you're going to eat them, and converting her yard to native habitat. So tonight we're going to learn ways to peacefully coexist with the wildlife that live all around you. And with that, I'd like to introduce Falyn Owens.
All right. Thank you very much, Monty. Let's see, my camera's on so you guys can see me, and I'm going to share my screen. I'm really, really happy to be here. I was asked to talk about coexisting with wildlife, and let me pick my screen here for a second, make sure you guys can see the presentation as intended. Does that look good?
Yes.
Excellent. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the less pleasant aspects of attracting wildlife into your neighborhood, but hopefully you'll walk away with some tools on what common issues arise and how to handle them and have some resources to go to if you have problems. And I could talk all day about all sorts of different species, but what I did was try to narrow it down to just a few that I could talk about and do, like, not a deep dive, but like a midway, not shallow, somewhere in the middle dive, about a few species. And hopefully there'll be plenty of time in the Q&A for you to ask questions about stuff that I didn't have time to talk about. So if you have a burning question about something that I did not talk about, I can probably talk about it if I know that you want to hear about it. So please, by all means, if you come up with a question, add it to the chat and we can address it in the Q&A. But first, I'll start by just making sure everybody's familiar with the Wildlife Resources Commission. Very, very briefly, for any of you who are not aware, I work for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, which is the state entity that is responsible for managing and conserving all of our native wildlife here in North Carolina. So that goes from the most common species that's everywhere to our most rare animal that's in need of protection and conservation and everything in between. So the Wildlife Commission is the entity that has the authority to take action and try to manage our wildlife. We're just a state agency, so we need a lot of help, which is why partners like the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and local chapters are so incredibly important, because everything that all of us do to help wildlife really makes a difference. So speaking of which, I know you guys like wildlife. That's why you're here. You wouldn't be part of the Wildlife Federation if you didn't appreciate wildlife. And as such, I'm assuming that all of you are aware that wild animals are losing habitat at a really frightening pace. It's one of the biggest challenges for especially sensitive species, sort of across the board. And as a corollary to that, I'm assuming that you understand the importance of creating habitat anywhere where we can, which includes our own backyards. Because if everybody does a little bit, then we can really at least move the needle in recreating the habitat that was lost when we've, developed these natural habitats. So I'm assuming that you're familiar with what wildlife need to survive and thrive, but I just kind of want to go over that just very, very quickly. and this is old news to most, if not all of you, wildlife need a few simple things. They need food, they need water, and according to your signs, they need cover and places to raise young, but I'm going to lump that under shelter. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm mostly going to refer to food and shelter. So that's kind of what's going to come up over and over again. And honestly, most of what I'm going to talk about is food because a lot of times food is a source of a lot of the conflicts we see. Not all though. So food and shelter is something that we can create in our yards to and we can have an influence on how much of these things are provided in our yards, what kind of food and shelter, and also the quality of that food and shelter. And those are things that we can manipulate on our own properties to create great places for wildlife to thrive while also minimizing the possibility that we don't get along with our wild neighbors. So, of course, and I know this quote is so old at this point, I'm wondering how many of you actually recognize where it comes from. Field of Dreams is the answer. But if you build it, they will come. I think we kind of understand that if you provide those things that wildlife needs, then basically that's what you're going to get. But you can't necessarily control what wild animals are attracted to the habitat that you create there. So in residential settings, we see a lot of situations where wildlife that we assume would be only out there in the wilderness somewhere, out in the woods, out away from us, not in our cities and suburbs and backyards, they actually do really, really well in our residential spaces. So, these tend to be species that are generalists, that are really well adapted to surviving close to humans and thriving on the types of habitats that are also good for humans. So we get a lot of conflicts mostly with these species that are well adapted to surviving alongside us. And going back to the habitat, the food and the shelter that we're providing, I think it makes sense, intuitive sense, for most people to understand the importance of providing habitat that is as close to natural as possible, right? Because that provides the resources that wildlife evolved with, that they understand, and that they know how to thrive on in a balanced way, right? If we want to have a sustainable, balanced ecosystem, we need to provide resources that can help maintain a balanced ecosystem. And the best way to do that is with native plants. So, native trees, shrubs, wildflowers, native grasses, these are what wildlife have thrived on for millennia, and they really provide the best form of habitat that we can provide. So this is the gold standard. This is a fantastic way to provide food and shelter, and of course you can add water too. But food and shelter are really, really provided in the best possible way with native plants. But there are other types of food and shelter that people have a tendency to provide at their homes, and those can be less natural, sort of more artificial sources of potentially natural foods. Um, Sometimes less natural foods. Corn is a domestic product produced by humans. And then there's also things that we've provided for wildlife, or that sometimes we provide for wildlife accidentally, that we didn't intend for wild animals, but these are still sources of calories, usually in high density, sources of fat, sugar, protein, all the stuff that animals need to survive. And so these are these sort of artificial foods that sometimes we have in our yards that are more likely to lead to conflicts. And that's because usually they are providing a supernatural density of calories that are like hyper attractive to wild animals in a way that's totally unnatural. Now, I'm going to focus in on this one a little bit because I know it's controversial. I know people love bird feeders. people get a lot of joy out of bringing birds close to their home where they can maybe watch the birds directly from a window. But if you think about it, if you invite guests to your home, would you maybe serve your dinner in one bowl that you expect everybody to eat directly from? And maybe if you have house guests for more than a meal, maybe they're staying for multiple days, would you expect them to eat from the same bowl for all of those meals without washing it in between and expecting everybody to eat from that same bowl? I'd like to think that that's not really something that we would consider because we intuitively understand that that's not sanitary. But when we provide piles of food in a container that animals can come and visit whenever they want to, they're going to be adding their saliva onto that. They're going to be basically swapping saliva and feces. And really, this is not a sanitary situation. And we actually see problems caused by bird feeders in a lot of different ways. One of which is because, well, for better or for worse, wild animals don't know that bird seed is just for birds. Essentially, this is a really highly concentrated pile of protein and calories and fat, and all sorts of wild animals are attracted to bird seed. Omnivores, um, omnivores and herbivores, even maybe not in central North Carolina, but in the mountains and the coast, we have a really robust bear population. And the predators of the animals that are attracted to the bird feeders are also attracted as well. So when we put up bird feeders, we're not just feeding birds, we're feeding pretty much any wild animal that discovers that food source. And some of these animals you might not want in your yard. Some you might be fine with, but maybe your neighbor doesn't want these animals in your yard and passing through their yard either. Even more disturbing than you can't control what comes to the feeder is that, as I mentioned before, putting a pile of food in one place that any animal has access to is a really great way of spreading diseases. Um, Bird feeders particularly can spread bird diseases such as salmonella poisoning, avian conjunctivitis, avian pox, and right now we're going through an ongoing high path avian influenza outbreak, all spread by, these feeding sources where birds are coming to feed off of the same location. And with bird feeders, that's going to spread bird diseases, but if you have piles of food that attract other animals, there are other diseases that can be spread too. Rabies and distemper are diseases that are spread through, foxes and raccoons. And raccoons definitely attracted to bird feeders. And then there are other diseases as well, like chronic wasting disease, which is fatal to deer, and we found recently in North Carolina. And some of these diseases are even really dangerous for humans. So you can see this report from 2021 where a salmonella outbreak killed thousands of finches in parts of the United States. And that same outbreak actually caused 14 human hospitalizations from people exposed to salmonella through bird feeders and bird baths. So bird feeders can actually spread diseases to humans as well. I'm not saying this always happens, but it's something to consider when we're providing food for wildlife. We need to be doing it in a responsible way. And the most responsible way is providing food in the most natural way possible. Because if we provide food in a super abundant amount, we end up seeing problems such as overabundant populations of wild animals. Wildlife tend to reproduce at a rate that is dependent on how much food they have access to. So the more food they have access to, the more they reproduce, which can, in the end up in a situation where there's far more animals in a small area than that environment would be able to support naturally. And you can see some examples here. These are not good situations. These are situations where we might see disease outbreaks spread because these animals are overpopulated. And oftentimes these overpopulations are the direct result of too much access to unnatural foods. So to conclude sort of that piece of it, again, probably the best possible way that we can provide habitat is the most natural way possible. If you want to feed wildlife, plant native plants that provide that food naturally, and that can avoid some of the unpleasant consequences of these unnatural food sources that can lead to harm to the animals themselves and even harm to people and pets. And I'll talk a little bit more about pets in a second. So let's talk about some common issues with common species. Just a quick selection of them, and we'll see if this is useful to some of you, and then we'll discuss anything else later in the Q&A. But before I kind of go into some species examples, I want to talk briefly about relocation, because usually, and especially for somebody who is prone to really appreciating and loving wildlife, the first time they have some kind of conflict with a wild animal in their yard, their first inclination, their gut reaction is to say, okay, best way to solve this, let's trap it and take it a couple miles away and release it, and it'll be happy and thrive, and it won't be in my yard anymore. And this will be the perfect solution. It feels good on the surface, but there's a lot of problems with the realities of relocation. The first one is they're already home. Wild animals have home ranges, home territories where they know where to find food, they know where the shelter is, they know where the water is, they know what's safe from predators, like how to stay safe from predators. They know where the predators tend to be and where the predators tend not to be. They know where the roads are. They tend to know when the roads are busy or not. This is where they know how to survive and thrive. And when you take a wild animal and move it somewhere outside of its home range, you are not doing it any favors. Imagine what it'd be like if somebody kidnapped you from your own house and just transported you to the middle of nowhere in Texas and dropped you off on the side of the road. That's kind of what it's like when you relocate a wild animal. One patch of woods might look identical to you than another patch of woods, but it looks very, very different to a wild animal that actually has to live and survive in those woods. One area is not created equal to another. And all that is to say that actually, in a lot of cases, relocation feels like it's a success because you release the animal, it runs out of the cage, and that's the end of the story to you. But oftentimes, wildlife do not survive relocation. It's often a death sentence because they get eaten by a predator, they starve because they don't know where the local food resources are, or even they get killed by members of their own species, because a lot of wild animals are territorial and they will attack any animal of their own species that comes into their territory. And if they actually manage to make it back home, because that's their first instinct, they're going to try to get back home. They've got really good homing instincts in general. So if they manage to succeed in finding their way back to the home that they originally were in, then you haven't solved the problem, right? The wild animal might be happy, but if you relocated it because it was causing problems, that's exactly what it's going to continue to do. Also, is it really responsible to take an animal that's causing problems on your property and put it somewhere else where it's probably going to end up in somebody else's backyard? So there's an amount of relocating the problem and making it somebody else's problem, which is not very great. And then, of course, because even though it's unpleasant to think about, it's also very important to understand that when you move a wild animal somewhere else, you are also moving all of the parasites and all of the diseases that it's carrying. And there are some diseases that we really, really do not want to be moving around on the landscape. For example, rabies is, well, let's say this, North Carolina is one of the top 6 states in the entire country for rabies. So we take rabies very serious. And that is the reason why a lot of our rabies vector species, or species that can carry rabies, cannot legally be relocated in North Carolina. So the last point about relocation is that in most situations, it is not legal to relocate wildlife for all the reasons listed here. It's not humane, it can spread diseases, and really it can do a lot more harm than good. So let's just get that out of the way. I'm not going to recommend relocation for any of the problems that I mentioned for the rest of this talk, for all of these reasons. All right, on a lighter note, let's talk about deer. Um, I used to be the deer biologist in Indiana, so I could talk ad nauseum about deer. They are amazing animals, they're wonderful, and they can cause a lot of issues, especially homeowners that are trying to grow lots of native landscaping in their yard, because deer, of course, evolved to eat all of the wonderful native plants that we want to put in our yards for habitat, which is great. You know, when you plant things in your yard as habitat for wildlife, you have to sign up for the fact that animals are going to eat it. That's kind of why you're putting it there. You know, those plants need to be eaten by insects and herbivores to be the base of the local food web. So, you know, when you plant a native plant, like you can't be too upset if something eats it. Um, but of course, with deer, they're really big, right? They're huge herbivores, so they can eat a lot of plants. And especially if you have just planted some new, you know, maybe some asters or something like that, and they haven't really set into the ground yet, deer can really do a lot of damage, and it can be expensive, especially if you're paying for potted plants. So let's talk a little bit about what the options are if you have deer in your neighborhood and they're getting into your yard and they're causing damage to the stuff that you have lovingly planted in your yard to support wildlife. First thing is going to be exclusion. And exclusion basically means you're keeping that animal out of a place so that it doesn't get access to the food in the first place. I'm going to talk about some different forms of exclusion, but we'll start off with what's successful and effective to exclude deer. And I'll get to that in a second. Repellents can also be a way to deal with deer issues, especially for specific plants. It's something that you apply to a particular plant that basically makes the plant taste bad so that deer don't want to eat it. And then finally, though this is not always an option everywhere, it can be a really valuable option in some places, especially out in the county, if not in like a major city. So let's talk about each of these in turn. Deer exclusion fencing. Um, Deer are big animals and they are very good at jumping. So if you want to keep deer out of your yard, the most effective way to do so is to have a fence that is at least 8 feet tall. That's a lot. That's certainly taller than your typical chain link fence or even your typical wood panel fence, which is usually about 6 feet tall. And by the way, a 6 foot tall fence is really good at keeping wild canids out, which I'll talk about later, but not good for keeping deer out. So a good deer fence needs to be at least 8 feet tall. But if you notice in the picture here, that doesn't mean that it has to be this impenetrable wall that, you know, precludes any kind of visibility. This is an example of an effective deer fence. This is 8 feet tall, but it's open. You know, deer are big animals and they can't squeeze through tiny holes. So this is an actual effective fence because the bottom half has smaller holes that deer can't squeeze through, and the top has these bigger holes that deer are not going to be able to jump through. So in total, it's 8 feet tall, and deer cannot get past it, but it's still very attractive and you can see through it. So there's a lot of different ways of creating an effective deer fence. Um, Here is a sort of smaller version of that. If you're trying to keep deer out of a really big area, you definitely need that 8 foot fence. But if you want to keep them out of maybe a little garden, such as here, It doesn't have to be the whole 8 foot tall fence. If it's an area that's small enough that deer are not going to want to jump into basically what amounts to a cage, they don't like feeling enclosed. So if it's a small enough space, you can get away with a shorter fence. But if you notice toward the bottom of this fence, the holes get smaller. So basically, deer fawns, which are about the size of a house cat, can't get through there. Um, so this is kind of a smaller version, and an even smaller version of this would be protecting an individual plant from deer. So you can use some wire fencing and some metal poles and sort of wrap them around an individual plant if that plant just keeps getting hammered by deer and they're maybe ignoring everything else. You can just protect that individual plant. So these are all examples of deer exclusion fencing that will keep the deer from getting access to the plants that you're trying to protect. Okay, deer repellents. Um, so you'll notice on the list of what works to deal with deer problems, I didn't mention plants that are deer resistant, and that's because there's no such thing, for better or for worse, there is no such thing as a deer proof plant. That's why you'll never see the word deer proof plant. You'll see deer resistant on some lists. And that's because deer will avoid eating some plants until they're desperate. And then at that point, if they're hungry enough, there's no plant that deer will not eat. Um, so you can learn about that through trial and error. If you plant a bunch of things in your yard and you see that certain plants are really being taken out by deer, those are plants that you might want to use a repellent or to have an exclusion fence around. But if you do that, then the deer might start eating another plant that you haven't protected because they'll eat what's available to them. That said, deer in general don't really like very strong flavors. So you're probably not going to see deer eating your rosemary or your spearmint. So they don't like very strong flavors. That's minty flavors, spicy flavors, herbal. If you like tear a leaf and it has a really strong aroma, that's probably something that deer are not going to prefer. And that goes with pine as well. Um, and if you like crush a leaf and it doesn't have any aroma at all other than general like a chlorophyll smell, that could be something that deer might find very palatable. So, that's a general rule of thumb that can be very effective just to kind of figure out if it's a plant that deer might, target versus not. But getting back to repellents, these are sprays that you can buy or you can make them yourself. And essentially, you can spray them on a plant to give it a strong flavor that deer will not find tasty. They have a good sense of smell, but when it comes to not wanting to eat something, you're not trying to create a smell that repels them. You're trying to create a taste that they don't like. So they might nibble a little bit, they taste it, they don't like it, and then they go find something else to eat. Um, the problem with repellents is that you have to keep applying it every time it rains. So there's a little bit more maintenance with this, but it can be a really effective way to deter deer from a particular plant. Um, Other types of scents or flavors that deer don't like, anything that tastes or smells like something rotten, or like a dead animal. So you'll find some repellents that have bone meal or some sort of like blood meal, or especially if you see that the active ingredient is putrescent egg solids, that can be especially effective to deter deer. And again, it's not that it creates a smell that they don't like, it's that when they nibble on it, they get that taste in their mouth, and that's what really makes them not interested. So you have to spray it directly onto the plant. The cool thing about these repellents is that often the same repellents that work to keep deer away are effective to keep rabbits away. So, you get kind of a 2-for-1 special if you decide to use repellents. Okay, and then finally for deer, You know, whether it's pleasant to think about or not, um, deer are a prey species, and they evolved to maintain a population equilibrium in the presence of predators. And here in North Carolina, the predators that deer evolved with, for the most part, don't exist anymore. The main historic predators for white-tailed deer were red wolves, which we have in very, very tiny amounts in eastern North Carolina, but certainly not all over North Carolina. And the other one was mountain lions, which have been extirpated for over 100 years. So the main predator, sort of natural predator for deer, is coyotes here in North Carolina today. And, I'm going to talk about coyotes later, but the coyotes that we have here in North Carolina are very small. They max out at about 40 pounds. And essentially, the biggest deer that a coyote can realistically take down as a prey animal is a newborn fawn. So the basically the only preying on deer that coyotes do here in this state is eating newborn fawns, and that's something that deer evolved with. That's why they have all of their fawns within the same few weeks, basically to create so many fawns all at once that there's no way that the predators could eat all of the fawns and enough of them to survive to become big enough and strong enough to then avoid predation once they're a few weeks old. So all that goes by way of saying that we don't really have the same natural predators here in North Carolina that we did in the past. So one way that we can compensate for that is through hunting. And the benefits of hunting go both ways. It helps to balance out deer populations, but also venison is a very healthy and sustainable form of protein for humans. It's delicious when prepared correctly. And not only is it great for whoever harvested the animal, but there are a lot of programs that exist to make it easy to donate venison to those in need, like food pantries. So there's a lot of ways to do good through uh, through hunting deer. Of course, the downside of this particular option is that it just might not be possible in your area. In Wake County, particularly, um, I know the city of Raleigh, which is where I'm a resident, they have laws in place that say that you cannot discharge a firearm and you cannot discharge a bow and arrow if the arrow has a broadhead tip, which is what you would use to hunt with. So essentially, the law in Raleigh means that you can't hunt deer. Now, if you live in another city, it might have laws that allow for hunting. Um, and certainly if you don't live in a city or town and you live in the county, then you would be able to hunt as an option if that was something that you were interested in. So it's worth recommending, although I totally acknowledge that it might not be feasible where you live in particular. Okay, so let's see. We're going to move on from deer and talk about raccoons and squirrels. I lumped these guys together because a lot of the types of issues that they cause are really similar to one another. And a lot of times, a lot of the complaints that at least people in the Wildlife Commission get with these animals revolve around them getting into bird feeders, getting into pet food, people who are feeding their pets outside. So, the first way to deal with some of these issues is to remove the food sources. And these are very, very opportunistic, very creative, agile animals. They're excellent climbers. They will get to that food. There's amazing videos on YouTube of anti-raccoon or anti-squirrel feeders, and it's just mind-boggling how skilled these animals are at getting to these food sources, regardless of what crazy obstacles that we put in the way. But in the end, if you're having problems with squirrels or raccoons and there's a food source that they're obviously coming to, the bird feeder will be easy to take down. The oak tree that's putting acorns all over the ground is a little bit of a different story. But I'll talk about some of the issues that you can still resolve. But first things first, if there's a food resource that you can remove, that's going to be option number one. Um, One of the main issues that we see with raccoons and squirrels is them getting into buildings. So, a really important way to prevent conflicts with these animals, if you have them on your property, which you probably do, even if you're not aware of it, is to shore up your house and make sure that your roof is in good condition, the fascia and the soffits on the roof are in good condition, and basically there's just no ways for animals to get in. And I'll talk about that in a second. Um, ugh, this this situation right here, it just makes me so nervous. Again, remove the pet food. Please don't feed your pets outside if wild animals are coming and accessing that food. Um, Raccoons are the #1 rabies vector species in North Carolina. So I look at a picture like this and I automatically think this is a situation where disease could be transferred um, from the raccoon to the cats, from the raccoon to the humans who are changing that food bowl. This is just, it might be cute, but this is not a good situation. We don't want to be providing these types of foods for wild animals. And it's much better to provide natural foods that they can forage in a more natural way. Um, these are some of the types of damage that we often see with raccoons and squirrels. To the left, this is a lawn that had a grub issue. And raccoons, they have these great little hands. They almost have human hands, and they're able to curl and manipulate stuff. So they are omnivores, and they love to eat all sorts of different things, including birds, eggs, and insects. And they will actually peel the turf grass back to get to grubs if you have a grub infestation in your yard. So this is actually raccoon damage because the raccoons found out that there were grubs and they peeled back all that grass to get to the grubs. Um, the best way to handle a situation like this is to treat the yard for the grubs, to get rid of the grubs. Or honestly, at this point, there's been so much damage that there probably aren't any grubs left, and the raccoons are going to lose interest anyway. Once the grubs are gone, the raccoons will stop doing that. And then over to the right, you can see this chewing damage. Squirrels are rodents, and rodents have teeth that are constantly growing over the course of their entire lives. So they have to chew on stuff. They just have to. They're not necessarily sharpening their teeth, they're wearing their teeth down, because if they don't do that, then their teeth will literally keep growing to the point where they can't close their mouths and they can't eat. So if you've got squirrels on your property and you're experiencing damage like this, I've got a handy little recipe for you. Basically, you can try to keep the squirrels out of the area, but they are excellent climbers, and it's really hard to keep squirrels completely away from an area if it provides suitable habitat for them. But if they're chewing on something very specific that you don't want them to chew on, um, basically you can make your own spicy spray that you can apply onto that surface, especially if it's wood. And here's a little recipe here. You just take some hot peppers, whatever peppers you get from the store, jalapenos, habaneros, doesn't really matter. Simmer it in water, add a little bit of oil to carry the capsaicin, which is the chemical that makes peppers spicy. Add a dash of dish soap so that the oil and water can mix. Put it in a spray bottle and spray it onto the thing that you don't want the raccoons, or excuse me, the squirrels to chew on. Be careful about something that might discolor, because this DIY spray could discolor, white painted wood or something like that. But essentially, when the squirrels get that spray into their mouth, they can taste that spicy flavor and they don't like it. It doesn't hurt them, but it certainly gives them a reason not to keep chewing on that thing. So that can be a great little do-it-yourself remedy to keep squirrels from chewing on something that you don't want them to. Okay, and then here, this is something that we see really often with both squirrels and raccoons. Um, they're both good climbers. they both nest in trees or den in trees in the case of raccoons. So if they can get onto a roof and say the roof is in poor condition and there's a little bit of rot or there's a slight gap, they both have the ability to either chew or use their hands to kind of pull and scrape and grind in order to get access. And we see a lot of issues of people having or finding out that they've got squirrels or raccoons actually in their attic. And oftentimes they're raising young in the attic. So this is a situation that you can prevent either by doing inspections of your home and looking for situations like this and making repairs before you have an issue. Or if you have trees up close to your house, one of the best things you can do is prune the tree branches so that they are at least 5 or 6 feet away from any buildings. Because if you can keep raccoons or squirrels from accessing the roof in the first place, they'll jump a certain distance. But if they have to jump 6 feet to get onto the roof, they're probably not going to do it. So, trimming the trees and just making sure that any branches aren't overhanging the roof or coming up close to the building is a really great way to just keep these animals from getting access to the building in the first place. Now, when you make repairs, if you have an issue like this, you're going to want to use things like wire. Certainly, wood is great, but especially since squirrels can chew, they can chew through wood very easily. You want to make sure that you incorporate metal into the repairs because that's something that squirrels can't chew through. Now, if you find out that you have squirrels or raccoons in the attic, you're probably not going to want to make repairs until you get them out. You can get a professional to trap and remove those animals, but there's also some deterrents that you can put up into the attic to basically scare them off. Things like strobe lights or something that makes a lot of consistent noise, like a radio or some device that is playing sports or talk radio to make it just sound like there's people up in the attic all the time. And that can be a good way to just kind of get them to leave so that you can make repairs and prevent them from getting back in. Okay, so that was my spiel about squirrels and raccoons. Let's shift gears again, and now we're going to talk about coyotes and foxes, because this is something that we get a lot of calls about, a lot of complaints about. Coyotes and foxes are probably the number one and number two species that we get complaints about in North Carolina, and they are ubiquitous. They are everywhere within the state. So let's talk about them. We've got 3 wild canids that are common across the state. Of course, there's a fourth one, and that is the red wolf, but we have very, very, very few of them and only in a very specific part of the state. So all these guys right here are common across North Carolina. And I kind of uh, designed the slide to make it really easy to see just how similar 2 of these species are if you don't have a good sense of their size. So here, if you didn't already know, here's the labels to these animals. We've got the gray fox up on the top left, the coyote on the bottom left, and then our red fox. Now, of course, there is a big size difference between gray foxes and coyotes. Gray foxes are about the size of a house cat, and coyotes are roughly the size of a small German shepherd. But unlike domestic dogs, coyotes actually max out at about 35 or 40 pounds. So even though they can be the size of a small German shepherd, they're really all skin and bones. They're really scrawny animals, and they're just like mostly fur. So they're much lighter than they appear, and that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about what kind of animals a coyote can actually eat for prey. They really can't take down a big animal. So mostly they're going to be eating smaller animals, similar to the types of animals that foxes are going to be eating. So let's focus just on coyotes for a little bit. This is a graph showing the average reports for every month about just coyotes. People calling the Wildlife Commission because they saw a coyote because they heard coyotes were in the neighborhood. Somebody saw one in their neighborhood. They saw it on a trail camera. They saw a coyote eating their backyard chickens. So these are all the reports, and you'll see that really there is a peak season where we get reports, and it's actually right about now. So October, November, and December are when young coyotes that were born this past spring have gotten old enough and mature enough to go off on their own and go find a territory and a mate and settle down as adults. Now, when they do that, they're young and naive, and just like human teenagers, they can be a little bit more noisy. They can be a little bit less knowledgeable about the rules of etiquette, and sometimes they can get into more trouble. So we see a peak in sightings this time of year, and whether or not the coyotes are actually causing problems, we get reports from people saying like, "Oh, I heard there was one in my neighborhood. What should I do?" There's a lot of fear about coyotes, and hopefully I can kind of tell you a little bit about what to really worry about with these animals. Okay, so realistic risk based off of the reports that we actually get here in North Carolina about coyotes from the public. Outdoor cats going missing, really, whether it's because of coyotes or not, oftentimes coyotes are blamed. Off-leash dogs, all right? So especially small breed dogs that are left unsupervised, that is definitely a risk factor for having coyote issues. Unprotected small livestock, and that basically amounts to your backyard chickens, maybe ducks, but small fowl. Or if you have a farm, lambs and goat kids, so pretty small livestock animals. It's got to be fairly small for a coyote to be able to overpower it. So the top three here they're all domestic animals that honestly we have control over, that we can protect from predators. And then the bottom one here, the habituated individuals. Habituated is a word that means an animal that is naturally wild, but has been trained to have lost its fear of humans. Think an orphaned animal that was found by somebody as a baby that got hand raised until it grew up, and as an adult, it doesn't fear humans the way it should under normal circumstances. And we've seen in some scientific research that shows that coyotes, or when we look at all the reports of when coyotes have bitten a human being, the majority of those cases have involved a coyote that people had been hand feeding, or that animal had been hand fed at some point in its life. So long story short, don't try to turn coyotes into pets. Even if you find them as pups and they're young and cute, they are wild animals, and they're more likely to be dangerous if they have an unnatural comfort around humans. So the cool thing about all of this is that all of these situations are preventable because we have control. Human beings have control of whether or not these animals are exposed to predators or are put in a situation where they are in close proximity to people. So let's think about what type of prey coyotes are going to be eating out in the wild. They are omnivores, and they love to eat fruit and nuts and berries, and insects. They eat lots of cicadas when we have a cicada year. Um, but in terms of prey animals, primarily they're going to be eating things like mice, rats, moles, voles, all of your small rodents, and our lagomorphs, or our rabbits. So that's kind of the range of natural prey for coyotes. And you can see on the bottom here, we've got our domestic versions. So animals that are kind of roughly the size of a rabbit, that if a coyote saw, and like out in the open with no human beings nearby, would easily say, It's about the size of a rabbit. Why not? Looks like dinner to me." So, this is all situations where we have control over these animals, and we can protect these animals from wild predators and let them basically act as natural pest control by controlling the rabbit population, controlling the mouse population. They're actually doing really good work out there. Coyotes and foxes are a really good form of sort of small rodent population control. But we need to make sure our pets are supervised or kept in enclosures that protect them from predators. Outdoor cats. I hope everybody who is listening here is very well aware that outdoor cats are very dangerous to our wildlife, especially songbirds and small reptiles. But not only are outdoor cats dangerous to wildlife, but the outdoors is dangerous to cats. Coyotes will definitely eat free-range cats. So if you have cats and sometimes you let them outside, you might want to reconsider that because the safest cat is one that is kept indoors. Or if they just really, really want to be outside, you could build a catio for them and allow them to experience nature without essentially being part of the food chain, which is what happens when we let our cats outside, right? They become part of the food chain, both as predators and as prey. Okay, and then hazing. So hazing is an interesting it's an interesting thing. People often say, there's a coyote in my neighborhood and I've seen it and it didn't seem to be afraid of me. What do I do? I'm so afraid of this animal. And really, if you see a coyote and it doesn't seem to be too afraid, but otherwise looks healthy and content, one of the best things you can do is basically just chase it off. And so I don't know if you can hear this. I don't think I turned on the audio for this, but essentially, this is a biologist from Florida, and she's just waving her arms and she's walking towards the coyote. And this reaction from the coyote to just kind of prance away and put some distance between itself and the person. This is exactly what you would expect from a healthy coyote. Human beings are really big. We are much bigger than coyotes, and they realize that if they were to get into a fight with a person, they are going to lose that fight. So, don't feel afraid if you see a coyote that looks a little bit too comfortable, or a fox even. As long as it otherwise looks healthy, just chase it off, be consistent, be persistent until it leaves. And if you do that repeatedly, basically you're creating an uncomfortable environment that will entice it to basically just not come around anymore. Okay, and I could talk about coyotes all day, but if you want to know more, I usually give hour or hour and a half long talks about coyotes because there's so much to say about these really cool critters. If you're interested in learning more, there's a QR code right there, and you can watch a pre-recorded video of me talking about coyotes. It's much, much longer, so you can learn more if you're curious. But for now, I'm going to move on and talk about foxes really quickly. Um, let's see. So I showed you when we see the most reports, like the most complaints about coyotes, and this is what we see for foxes. And it's a little bit the opposite of what we see with coyotes. So if you look here, the peak of when we see complaints about foxes is really in kind of in the springtime and early summer when foxes are raising their young. The reason for that, especially compared to coyotes, is that, well, coyotes do not like to den near people. They might physically be close, like they might build a den in a neighborhood, but they're going to build it in the very, very back of that backyard that's owned by the person who never goes outside. They're not going to build their den anywhere where they ever see people. But foxes are actually pretty okay with building their den and raising their young fairly close to humans. And that's why we see a lot of concerns and complaints during the kit rearing season. And we see this type of situation a lot. So somebody calls, they say, suddenly there are foxes coming out from underneath my shed. What do I do? Oftentimes they're really worried about something like rabies. Foxes are one of our rabies vector species here in North Carolina. Not all foxes, not most foxes have rabies, but it's something to be concerned about if you have foxes living very close to you. So the best way to deal with a situation like this is really to prevent it in the first place. Um, Again, going back to that exclusion, preventing them from getting access in the first place, installing sort of wire mesh, chicken wire or hardware cloth, and making sure that there's a barrier so that animals can't get underneath buildings is a good way to prevent this from happening. And of course, if you have foxes denning in your yard and you don't mind it, that's fine. Just wait it out, enjoy from a window. You can have a really great experience watching the kids grow up. But if you don't want to have foxes in your backyard, by all means, there's a variety of deterrents that you can use to basically humanely get them to just find somewhere else to be. So here's some options here. You can use noise, water deterrents. So this is an image showing motion detecting sprinklers that you can find at most hardware stores these days. And they spritz water when they see motion. So that can be a really great way to get all sorts of wild animals that you don't want into your yard to just basically stop hanging around if they get sprayed with water every time they come around. Smell deterrents can be great too. If you have foxes or skunks or an opossum maybe getting underneath your crawl space in your house, ammonia can be a really great smell deterrent that will basically smell so bad that they just leave on their own. And the way you would do that is kind of pouring household ammonia onto a rag, and then you put that rag into like a Ziploc bag and poke holes so that just enough ammonia can sort of seep out of the bag for it to create the smell, but not dry out very quickly. And then you would kind of throw that under where the foxes or skunks were, and that can sort of get them to move on. And as I mentioned before, foxes cannot be relocated. They're one of our rabies vector species. Also, raccoons cannot be relocated. Deer cannot. And who else did I mention? So foxes, coyotes, deer, raccoons. Anyway, most animals you can't relocate. Squirrels you can. Okay, so since I'm talking about foxes, and a lot of people are really concerned about foxes that they've seen in their yard or in their neighborhood, I want to talk a little bit about when you should be concerned and when you don't need to be concerned about foxes or any of the animals that could potentially have rabies. So our major rabies vector species are mostly going to be raccoons and foxes, but also skunks. And though it's pretty rare, coyotes. Um, and those are kind of the main ones. So when should you be concerned? Rabies causes neurological signs. It essentially destroys the brain systematically until the animal dies. So an animal with rabies is going to look like it's got brain damage. It's not going to be acting normally. It's going to be acting really weird as if it had some kind of brain damage. Um, if you see crusty mucus around the eyes, that's actually not a sign of rabies, but it could be a sign of distemper, which is a disease that looks a whole lot like rabies. So if you see the animal acting really funky and it's got crusty eyes, it could have distemper, especially if it's a fox or raccoon. Still a sign of concern, especially if you have pets, but a different disease than rabies. Rabies causes seizures. So it causes animals to bite at things. It doesn't have to be living things. It can bite at inanimate objects like lamp posts or car tires or even just at the air. So if you see a fox or raccoon that's just biting at the air, that would be a sign of concern. And of course, everybody's familiar with the unprovoked aggression that rabies causes. And certainly you should be concerned if a person or a pet has been bitten by a wild animal, or if there's been direct physical contact. So, if you've got the neighborhood kid that comes into your house and they're holding a baby raccoon in their bare hands, that is definitely something that you would want to follow up with a medical professional with, because it could possibly mean that there has been exposure to rabies. So the phone number here goes to the sort of rabies hotline with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. They're excellent humans that man that hotline, and they can work you through what happened and whether or not you should follow up to see if the animal can be tested or if you need to get the rabies vaccine. So it's a great number to have in hand. Hopefully you would never ever have to call it, but it's there specifically to help guide people through what they should do if they might have been exposed to a rabid animal. Okay, and a little bit more about when not to be concerned. Fox in the neighborhood. Foxes are in the neighborhood. They're pretty common. That's not a reason to be concerned. Fox passing through your yard, also pretty normal. A fox out during the daytime. Wild animals that are nocturnal can be out during the daytime and it can be perfectly healthy and natural. Just because a nocturnal animal is out during the daytime does not mean it has rabies. Every single one of the pictures of raccoons and foxes that I've shown you in this presentation have been taken during the daytime. These animals are often awake in the daytime and it's not a sign of rabies. Also, when not to be concerned, you got a fox hanging around a food source. They're going to go to the food sources because they're hungry. That's very normal, healthy behavior. A fox ignoring people at a distance, if you're not posing an immediate threat to them and they're familiar with human behavior, they're going to ignore you if you're just gardening in your yard or if you're walking your dog on the sidewalk. So if they don't need to run away and they're used to people, they're not going to run away. If it runs away when you approach, that's a great sign of a healthy fox. Or a fox hanging around for weeks or months. If you are concerned about rabies, rabies is a disease that kills an animal within days. So if you've been seeing a fox hanging around for many weeks, it's not going to have rabies because it would have died. Okay, now I've got a short section on beavers, but I know I'm kind of over time and I really want to give people time to ask questions. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and kind of skip through this part so that we have time to get to the questions that people really, really want to ask. And if I'm making a terrible mistake and people really want me to talk about beavers, I can kind of talk about them after I've given people an opportunity to ask questions. So I'll kind of run through these slides real quick. Beavers eat trees. You can protect the individual trees with fencing. They cause flooding by building dams because they don't like the sound of running water. And there's cool devices that we can install to sort of prevent beaver flooding. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. When they're not feasible, we can also harvest beavers. And where to get help? If you're having wildlife damage issues, you can contact wildlife control agents. If you find an animal that looks like it needs help, like it's orphaned or injured, you can contact a wildlife rehabilitator. And I've got QR codes for finding rehabilitators in your area. And if you need to find access to wildlife control agents in your area that can help you out with any number of wildlife damage issues, we have a list of those people online, and there's a QR code for that too. And I think finally, I just wanted to mention that the North Carolina Wildlife Helpline is a resource that's available by phone or email. There are 4 wildlife biologists who man that phone line. And if you want to have a one-on-one conversation with a professional on what you can do if you have a question about wildlife, a problem, a concern, these individuals will be able to provide you individualized advice based on your situation that can include recommendations to professionals or do-it-yourself options. So this is a really great resource, and I'll leave that contact information there. That's the phone number and the email, and I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions if you have them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Falyn. That was fantastic. I had no idea that coyotes only got up to 40 pounds at the most. That's crazy. All right, we definitely have a lot of questions tonight. So let's start with, so you talked about some of the different repellents that you can spray on plants to deter deer and rabbits. Do those also repel pollinators? Are they something that our native insects will take notice of?
That's a really good question. I think it kind of depends. Certainly if you are, say for example, if you're growing asters, and I bring up asters because I have tried to plant asters in my yard many times and the rabbits just eat them down. And I accept that because I'm creating habitat for wildlife. Um, but the chemicals in asters, some insects can consume and some can't. But if you were to spray like a minty uh, deterrent onto it, that could potentially deter some caterpillar species that can't digest the chemicals in mint. So that's a really interesting question. And I would always say whenever you're applying any chemicals, whether it's a registered pesticide or it's a organic option, in the end, you really want to only apply these types of chemicals only where they're needed and only in the quantity that's necessary to get the job done. So it's not something I've never really thought about, but I'd say you want to target application of any kind of chemical exactly where it's needed and not sort of a broad spectrum across a wide area. And that will help reduce any negative impacts to your pollinators. I certainly a minty solution is not going to kill pollinators, but it might make them less tasty for caterpillars that you might want to support in your yard.
Awesome. Yeah. So definitely if that's a concern, don't spray it on flowers if at all possible. Keep it on the leaves, if you can. All right. And then there was a question when you talked about donating deer, for consumption, like at a food pantry or something, a request about kind of some of the requirements for deer and chronic wasting disease. Are deer tested for chronic wasting disease before they're distributed, for human consumption?
Yeah, um, so we chronic wasting disease is a relatively new disease here in North Carolina, and so far we've only found, I think, 30, it's somewhere in the 30s, maybe 32 to 36 deer that have tested positive for chronic wasting disease in very specific parts of the state. So we don't have a lot of CWD, and we're really trying hard not to get it in new places. But I can say that most of the deer processors that would be able to take in a deer and butcher it and process it down into a form that can then be donated to food pantries, they do test their deer for the most part. They've been excellent cooperators to submit CWD samples. And certainly, if you were to donate deer that you harvested or a friend harvested, I would say right now testing for CWD is free. The worst inconvenience is that you have to wait for the test result to come back. So if you're going to donate deer, I would definitely make sure that deer gets tested before you donate it, just in case, just as part of the do-gooding process. It's still free, and you just have to wait a few weeks to get the results.
Great. So while we're still talking about deer, somebody was sharing that they have some plants that are fenced in that they, are sure to protect for food production. So they make sure that that's fenced off for deer, but they have some plants that are outside of their fence, and they're kind of just wondering at what point are plants large enough to not be affected by deer browse. Is there a height limit? I'm sure it depends on the species if you got trees and shrubs, but at what point in general is there a rule, that plants aren't going to be killed by deer browse?
Yeah, it so much depends on how many deer there are. If you're just like overrun with deer and they're constantly nibbling on the plant to the point where it just literally can't grow enough foliage to photosynthesize, even a healthy mature plant could die if the deer browsing pressure is just really extreme. But if you're talking about, maybe there's only like a couple deer in the neighborhood and they might pass through, once a week. Like a fully mature, herbaceous plant, like I keep wanting to say asters, maybe, or I don't know, one of our native plants, solidago, a goldenrod. They can tolerate some amount of browsing. It's just the repeated browsing where they're getting hit over and over and over again, and they can't grow enough foliage to compensate for the browsing that can really reduce their energy reserves to the point that they die. So it's not so much that you have to prevent any amount of browsing from deer, but you definitely don't want there to be repeated browsing if you can avoid it. And certainly if it's newly planted, if you literally just put it into the ground and it doesn't even have its roots established yet, even one amount of like visitation of browsing could potentially kill that plant. So there's a lot of factors at play.
Yeah. And then we had a couple of questions about coyotes. Do we have any coyote wolf hybrids? Can they hybridize?
Coyotes and wolves can hybridize. They do not like to do that, though. Um, Usually we see hybrids in situations where literally there is no other option. And oftentimes, we'll see that in captivity, in artificial situations where somebody has put like a coyote and a wolf into the same pen and they had nobody else to choose from. Um, our coyotes here in North Carolina have a little bit of wolf DNA and a little bit of dog DNA from when they were first migrating into the state. And the lead coyotes who were like ahead of the curve and had arrived here first and didn't have any other coyotes to mate with, in some situations they did mate with dogs or um, I think the wolf genetics mostly come from up north, actually, because where we have gray wolves. Um, but long story short, behaviorally, coyotes and wolves do not act the same when they're raising their young. So that is a really good obstacle for them because they don't want to co-parent. Coyote parents are excellent parents. The male and the female will work together to raise young. Obviously, wolves do the same thing, but the way they do it is very different. So coyotes and wolves don't want to raise young together. They don't want to breed together, um, which is great. Even though it's technically possible, it's not likely.
That makes sense. And there was a request for the QR code for the Coyote Talk again. I
Yeah.
can send that out as well at the end, but yeah.
Do you want me to pull it up?
If
Or
it's easy for you to do, that would be great.
yeah, I think. Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing, and you can, if there's another question, I can sort of work on this um, while we're talking.
Sure. There was a question about reptiles and encountering a snapping turtle.
Reptiles encountering a snapping turtle. Snapping turtles will eat lots of like little tiny wiggly things when they're underwater, which could be reptiles. Especially if there's like a salamander or something that's swimming in the water. But usually they're going to be eating like worms and fish that swim past them in the murky water. So they'll eat anything that fits into their mouth, and that can include reptiles. But I don't know if it's super common. Probably more frogs than reptiles. Maybe a snake here and there.
They've got quite the bite, so make sure to keep a health and safety distance.
Mhm.
All right. Okay. Um, So as we're talking about reptiles and snakes, somebody has some copperheads in their yards, and main concern is their dogs. Any ideas for deterring copperheads, especially from hanging out around creeks?
Oh goodness. I've got some bad news in that regard, and I'm going to share this slide real quick so everybody can see it. Um, there isn't really a way to deter snakes. Like there's not anything that you could apply. Like there's no spray that you could apply to keep snakes away. Um, there are products out there that will try to convince you that they work to keep snakes away, but they don't work. There's no repellent that works against snakes. The best way to deter snakes is to not provide habitat for them. So, maintaining an area of lawn that your dogs can run around in is a great way to reduce the likelihood that copperheads might be there. But the fact of the matter is that they're common, and the good news is that they usually avoid. They don't want to bite at an animal that's larger than them. I go hiking with my dog in the woods all the time, and my dog has never been bitten by a copperhead. And we've seen copperheads. I've literally walked up to copperheads that my dog has run past. So their natural response is to freeze and try not to be seen by a bigger animal and hopefully not get stepped on. Um, Really honestly, especially in a creek situation where that's probably just really great copperhead habitat, keep your eyes open. If Try to see it before your dog runs up to it. There is aversion training. If your dog is really, really prone to like just messing around with any live animal that they come across, you can actually train the dog to avoid snakes or anything that looks like a snake. So that might be an option if you're really concerned. Um, yeah, snakes are pretty hard. Try to stay away from them if you can, and be careful when you're out in the woods in really, really good copperhead habitat.
Yes. Somebody says that they have opossums under their porch, and normally they wouldn't mind, but they seem to be sharing fleas with their dogs. And is there something that you can do besides just treating the dogs for fleas, giving them baths, cleaning their bedding, um, giving them free flea preventatives, stuff like that? And is there anything that they can do for the opossums? They say, I feel bad for the poor itchy little guys who can't get rid of their own fleas.
Oh my goodness. I would say there's not really going to be a good way to prevent wild animals from being exposed to wild parasites. Um, if you want to reduce the load of fleas like in in your yard, certainly just sort of enticing them not to be hanging around under your porch is probably a good option. But there's not really a good way to make sure that the opossums don't get fleas. Because if you think about it, the types of medications that are appropriate for your dog are not appropriate for other species. So certainly do not ever try to medicate wild animals on your own. That could potentially kill them. It can cause a lot of effects that are not great. Um, Wild animals are going to have fleas. But if you are treating your dogs with flea medication, that's very, very responsible, and I would recommend that regardless of whether or not you had opossums under your porch.
Okay. And then I see a comment from Anne. She's in Granville County and has been a little concerned about the lack of wild birds that she's been seeing there this year. They have feeders out and just aren't seeing the normal bird populations that they have in the past. And I think it looks like they're in Oxford or have seen other similar comments from other people. Any insights there?
Yeah, usually when I get a comment from somebody saying they're not seeing the birds that they're used to seeing, or they're not seeing the squirrels that they're used to seeing, oftentimes that's really, really localized. And, you could talk to somebody who lives half a mile away who's like, oh, yeah, I mean, I got them all over the place at my house. Um, the wild animals are going to go where the food is. They're going to go where, they feel safe. And certainly if you live in an area that's having like a lot of really great natural food around. If around your yard, outside of your property, there's just a lot of natural food. I know this is a great mast year, so there's lots of acorns, there's lots of natural foods on the landscape right now. They're not necessarily going to come to a feeder because they've got plenty of natural food and they don't need those human provided foods. So sometimes when you see the wild animals disappearing from the artificial food source, that can be a really good sign because they've got plenty of natural foods elsewhere and they don't need that sort of extra handout from people.
Wonderful. And certainly, somebody typed in the chat that you check with your local Audubon chapter, see if they have any other insights as well.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. Someone was saying that, let's see how to ask this as a question. Are there instances of healthy observations of wildlife? Salt licks was something that they put in there. Is there a way to attract them to a specific area, so that you can observe them in a way that is healthy for both humans and wildlife?
I understand the intention, but especially with salt licks and deer, you know, those mineral blocks are just as likely to spread chronic wasting disease as a pile of corn is. In the end, it's attracting animals to one spot and enticing them to put their face and their mouth onto that spot to either lick up salt or to eat the corn, and the end result is the same. It can spread diseases. So, that's why I say, like, providing natural foods is best, because you're providing food in a way that's distributing it over a larger area. So, maybe if you planted a food plot, or ideally some natural prairie, some native grasses and wildflowers, you're going to pull deer and other wildlife into that area, but they're going to be nibbling a little bit here, a little bit there. They're not going to be all eating off of the same plant, which is really where the danger lies. So, if you want to pull deer and be able to observe them, honestly, like, plant an oak tree. That's a really great way to provide food very naturally. The acorns are going to fall. They're not always going to be there. They're going to be there sometimes and sometimes not, and that's going to be far more natural. And sometimes, the best way to watch wildlife is to go and find a place where they would be, that has great habitat, and just sit and watch and be quiet. Um, it involves a little bit more work on our part. Buy a great pair of binoculars. But it's amazing what you can see if you find a good spot that has natural habitat and just stop and be silent and watch. And it's almost like the world will come alive, and you'll see all sorts of stuff you didn't expect to be there. Um, so in a lot of ways, you don't have to provide something that's going to be a super strong attractant. Just go where the animals are and watch and wait for them to come out.
Great answer. Okay, I think that was all the questions that I saw. If you have any last questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. I think I saw someone try to raise their hand, and I can unmute you if that's still an option, if you still have a question. Otherwise, I think that'll do it.
Awesome. Thank you for everybody who stuck around. And oh, there's so much more I could say.
Yes, are you doing a beaver presentation anytime soon?
I am going to be doing a beaver presentation for the for NC State Extension, and oh, it's not the Forestry Alliance. It's a whole bunch of foresters. So I don't know how open to the public it is, but I do presentations on request.
Which leads me to say how much we have really enjoyed, your talk today. I think, you can see from all the questions, and the interest is high. It is really great stuff. You have so much more to share that, I hope that you'd consider coming back, and let's talk about the beavers and the swine and all the other species that you weren't able to get to, because we would love to hear more. It was just a fantastic experience hearing all the knowledge that you shared tonight.
I'd love to talk more about any of these animals and more.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you again. I see lots of great comments in the chat. Everyone really enjoyed it and would love for you to come back.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a great rest of your night.